In the heart of the countryside, tucked away far from the nearest town, sat a small, humble farm. The air was thick with the rich scent of fresh hay, mingling with the earthy undertones of the surrounding fields. A faint breeze rustled through the open windows, carrying with it the gentle sounds of life on the farm: bleating goats, clucking chickens, and the occasional bark of rescue dogs. For the protagonist, a young child of no more than 10, life here was simple and predictable. The day began early, with the sun just rising over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Mornings were spent feeding the animals, afternoons in the old, creaky stable, where the child could escape into the world of books, reading stories of faraway lands and adventures that felt impossible. But all of it, every part of their existence, felt comforting, routine. It was the sort of life that wrapped itself around you like a warm blanket, safe and predictable. But that Thursday afternoon, so like every other, would mark the end of the tranquility they had always known. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting its warmth over the farm. The child walked toward the stable, a granola bar clutched loosely in their hand. Their backpack was half open, papers and books threatening to spill out as they walked, distracted by the snack. The dogs, as always, would be waiting for them, tails wagging, eager to greet the child with the kind of love only a dog could give. But as the child approached the gate, they stopped. The dogs were nowhere to be seen. There was no barking, no excited wagging of tails. The usual cacophony of animal sounds was absent, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. "Rex? Buddy," the child called out, a little nervous now. Their voice echoed into the empty air, but there was no reply. Only the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The child's brow furrowed in confusion. The dogs never missed greeting them. Then, faintly, a sound reached their ears: distant barking, muffled as if it were coming from far inside the stable. The sound sent a shiver down the child's spine. The dogs were locked in there? But how? The stable door was always left open for them to come and go as they pleased. Worry gnawed at the child's stomach. They pushed open the heavy wooden door, the rusted hinges creaking in protest. The dogs rushed out in a frenzy, almost knocking the child over with their excitement, but something felt wrong. They were frantic, like they'd been trapped in there for hours. Inside the stable, everything seemed normal. Hay bales were stacked in the corners, buckets of water stood by the walls, and shelves lined with farm tools filled the space. But as the child took in the scene, something felt off, like a presence in the air, a tension they couldn't quite place. As the child sat down on a bale of hay to calm the uneasy feeling that had settled in their chest, they noticed something out of the corner of their eye. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, slowly passed by the open door of the stable. The figure's movements were jerky, unnatural, as though each step was an effort, each movement too deliberate. The child froze. The man had wild, long gray hair that hung down his back in tangled clumps, as if he hadn't cared for it in months. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt and pale, a long, scruffy beard covering much of his face. His eyes, those eyes were wide and unblinking, the kind of eyes that seemed too focused, too knowing. He muttered to himself in a language the child couldn't understand. It was a chant, a low, almost inaudible murmur that sent a chill down their spine. What was he doing here? Who was this man? The child watched as the figure slowly shuffled toward the chicken coop, his hands stretched out, almost as if he were drawn to it. The dogs, who should have been barking or growling, didn't react. They were eerily calm, their tails not wagging, their eyes dull, as if they didn't even notice the intruder. The child's heart pounded in their chest as they watched the figure kneel beside the chicken coop. The man reached in and pulled out an egg, holding it in both hands like something precious. He looked down at it with a strange reverence, his eyes fixated on the shell as if it held some deep, terrible secret. Without warning, the man brought the egg to his mouth. He stared at the child, unblinking, as his teeth sank into the delicate shell with a sickening crack. The noise reverberated in the quiet air, sharp and unnatural, like the breaking of something far more fragile than just an egg. Yellow yolk dripped down his scraggly beard, staining it in a sickly hue. His eyes, wild and hollow, never left the child's face. The child couldn't move. A cold sweat broke out on their forehead. The man's gaze never wavered as he chewed, the sickening crunch of the egg filling the silence. It was as though the man was daring them to do something, anything. His eyes were so intense, so full of dark understanding, that it felt as though he could see into the very depths of their soul. Fear surged through the child, and without thinking, they screamed. The sound echoed in the air, sharp and desperate, breaking the trance that had bound them. The man's head snapped toward them, his movements slow, deliberate. His face was smeared with egg and dirt, his eyes dark pools of something unsettling. The calm in his expression made the child's blood run cold. He didn't react with anger or surprise. Instead, there was a strange, almost knowing calmness to his gaze, like he was expecting this all along. Panic set in. The child bolted from the stable, heart racing as the man's mumbling followed them like a shadow. The dogs, those loyal dogs, still stood by his side, licking his hands, as if they had known him for years. The child's mind raced. What was going on? Who was this man? And why didn't the dogs seem to care? The house was the only safe place. The child ran, their feet pounding against the dirt as they reached the door, fumbling to unlock it with trembling hands. Inside, they locked the door, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The sound of the man's chanting reached them from outside, disturbing in its monotony. The dog's quiet barks could be heard in the distance, too, as though they had never left his side. The child's mind raced, the horror of what they had witnessed still fresh. They needed help. With shaky hands, the child called their mother, explaining the situation between gasps. "Stay hidden," their mother instructed. "Stay away from the door. We're coming for you." It wasn't long before the police arrived. They swept the area, apprehending the man with a calmness that only made the child's fear grow. The police officers spoke in hushed tones, but it wasn't until later that the true nature of the man's presence came to light. A week later, the truth was revealed. The man wasn't a stranger. In fact, he had been living in the stable for months, surviving the harsh winters and the elements, hiding from the world. Homeless and mentally ill, he had found a refuge in the shadows of the farm. The dog's loyal, protective creatures had accepted him as one of their own, feeding him, keeping him company. The police explained how the man had been unseen for so long, his presence overlooked by the family. But the dogs, protective by nature, had long since become familiar with him, no longer seeing him as a threat. It was almost as if the dogs knew something the family didn't. The protagonist's mother, though deeply shaken, chose not to press charges. Instead, she offered the man help, ensuring he received the care he desperately needed. Over time, he regained his stability, found work, and even became a surprising ally to the family, a strange but welcome friend. Yet, despite everything, the child couldn't forget. The image of that man, the wild eyes, the haunting chant, the way he had devoured the egg stayed with them, lodged deep in their mind. It wasn't just the terror they had felt in the moment, but the realization that life could be strange, that even the most terrifying encounters could turn into something unexpected. Something both comforting and haunting at the same time. The house stood alone in the wilderness, a remote getaway nestled deep in the forests of Northern California. No neighbors for miles, no city lights to break up the dark nights, just the relentless expanse of trees and fields stretching out for miles. The protagonist, seeking escape from their busy life and yearning for a sense of peace, had accepted a job to house sit for a couple who lived far from the nearest town. It seemed like the perfect opportunity: extra cash, fresh air, and the promise of a few quiet weeks to recharge. The couple had even suggested an extra task, trimming their leftover stash of weed. What could go wrong? When the protagonist arrived, they found the house even more isolated than they'd imagined. It was beautiful in a rustic, eerie way. A large, charming farmhouse stood at the center of the property, while a small gardener's quarters sat off to the side, separated from the main house by a thick patch of overgrown grass. The couple, in an odd move, locked the door between the two units, telling the protagonist not to worry about it. It struck the protagonist as strange at first, but they brushed it off. After all, it was only a small detail. Everything else was mundane at first: feeding the dogs, watering the plants, trimming the stash. The days began to blur together, and with each passing hour, the initial excitement faded into a dull sense of isolation. But it wasn't long before something began to feel wrong, something that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. The isolation started to wear on the protagonist. It wasn't just the silence of the place, it was the noises. They began to hear them late at night. Quiet at first, then louder as the days passed: faucets running when no one had used them, the microwave door slamming shut in the empty kitchen, strange, soft murmurs that floated through the thin walls. Voices. But not just any voices, hushed, indistinct, like a conversation being deliberately kept secret. The house felt alive with a presence, something that existed just outside of view. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house, despite being locked out of the main portion. But when they went to check, everything seemed in order. The dogs, who normally barked at the slightest disturbance, showed no reaction. They lay still, their eyes half closed, as though they had long ago grown accustomed to the strange noises that echoed through the house. At first, the protagonist thought it was just their nerves playing tricks on them. But the noises didn't stop. And each time they happened, the hairs on the back of their neck stood on end, a creeping sense of dread rising in their chest. Something wasn't right. Someone, or something, was here, and the dogs knew it. The tipping point came one night. The protagonist had taken to spending more time outside, hoping the fresh air would calm their nerves. But that night, as the moon cast a faint glow over the house, something in the darkness caught their eye. Footsteps. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house, too close for comfort. The protagonist's heart raced. The footsteps came closer, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever was making them had stopped just out of sight. Fear gripped them, but they forced themselves to stay calm. They stepped inside the shadows of the house, praying that whoever was out there wouldn't see them. They waited, their breath shallow, as the footsteps continued. Only now, they were moving again, circling the house, closer with each step. Then, without warning, the figure appeared. A fleeting shadow darted past the window, and before the protagonist could react, the figure was gone, disappearing into the woods. The silence that followed was deafening. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Someone had been hiding here, living in the shadows, creeping around the house undetected. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who was it? Why were they here? The couple had locked the door between the two quarters, but that didn't explain the footsteps, the voices, or the figure in the woods. Panic began to take hold. The protagonists searched the house for hidden cameras, desperate for an explanation, but found nothing. No sign of intrusion, no obvious evidence of anyone living there, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. The fear began to twist inside the protagonist, gnawing at their sanity. They couldn't escape it. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was constantly watching, waiting for them to make a move. So they decided to fight back. But how? How do you fight something you can't see, something that lurks in the shadows? The protagonists started acting strange, odd, even. In a desperate bid to regain control, they blasted pop music through the house, filling the empty spaces with noise. They rearranged furniture, moved things for no reason at all, and even put on bizarre, exaggerated performances in front of the windows, as if to taunt whatever or whoever was watching them. The irrationality of it made them feel, if only for a moment, like they had some agency in the madness. But then came the texts. Texts from the couple, their tone growing stranger with each message. "How's the dog doing? Did you feed the plants? How's your day been so far?" The questions seemed innocent at first, but as the messages continued, they began to hint at things the protagonist had done that day, things that hadn't been mentioned. Things that could only be known if someone was there, watching. The hair on the back of their neck stood on end. Someone was in the house. Someone had been watching them all along. By the time the couple returned, the protagonist had had enough. The paranoia had become unbearable. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a prison. The tension, the sense of being watched, had seeped into every corner of their mind. The couple arrived, acting as if nothing had happened, their presence bringing no relief, only more questions. They didn't acknowledge the strange noises, the figure in the woods, or the bizarre texts. They acted like everything was normal, like nothing had ever been wrong. The protagonist felt the unease settle in their stomach, that deep, nagging sense that something was terribly wrong but that no one would ever admit it. When the protagonist finally left, it wasn't with a sense of relief, it was with a deep, unsettling dread that clung to them. The couple's strange behavior, the feeling of being watched, the footsteps in the dark, it all stayed with them. As they drove away from the isolated house, the woods fading into the rearview mirror, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the horrors of that house were far from over. The experience had twisted into something far darker than they could understand. Even now, the sounds, the whispers, the footsteps linger in the corners of their mind, a haunting reminder that some places, some experiences, are never truly left behind. They never fully leave you.